They're not debating it. There's this one guy who does all this stuff, and he goes on to show like it was a play or so later. He closes out on a guy, and he lunges to block the shot, and he hits the guy's thigh with his knee, and that's when it happened.
You don't have to be sore about it. It's okay.
I'm
Hey,
not,
Brian.
I'm not sorry about it. Hey, Brian.
Hey, sorry to keep you waiting a little bit.
Oh, no.
You're good. You're good.
Great to see you both.
It's good to see you, sir. Yeah.
You guys met what at Wild Goose? Is that when you guys go back?
I think Southeastern, probably with the Immokalee workers.
That's right.
Back in the day.
Back in Lakeland.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And where are you now?
I am now in Bryson City, North Carolina, Western
great.
Carolina. In the Smokies. It's beautiful.
I'm a fly fisherman, and so
wow.
neighborhood's an area I've wanted to fish. I fished around Asheville and those streams, but yeah.
Well, you have an open invitation. Just let me know. Our church has got a lot of friends with cabins and rentals.
You could hit the Nantahala. It's a
Tuckasegee.
beautiful fly fishing spot.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Good stuff.
Well, Brian,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Steve.
Go ahead.
Thanks for doing this. It's been a pleasure. We'll say this again, reading the book and enjoying it. And I'll say a few words just about your role in my life, and give a couple of words about our podcast. The whole point of doing Whistle Pig and the Bear, which is the oddest sounding podcast in the world,
I love it.
Is we have been able to be dear friends for 30 years now. And we went to the same college, same school, built houses next to each other. We now both live in North Carolina, but Steve and I are often on the other side from one another when it comes to politics or events or even spirituality. Yet we've always leaned in rather than pulled apart. And so this whole podcast is basically inviting people into our friendship and to hopefully model how we do what we do with one another. So
that's fantastic.
When we worked in student affairs at the university in Florida, and we were on a student affairs team together, and students would often come in and say, we have this unfiltered, just being ourselves, and folks would always say, you guys need to capture this. Mm-hmm. And so Matt and I were talking during the holidays of what's a way that we could honor that friendship and do exactly what he just said is showing people that you can come out of the echo chamber and lean into friendship. So yeah, so
beautiful.
This was a way of honoring that. But again, thanks for being with us.
Do you have any questions for us, or is there anything in particular that that you would like us to get out there? Or, I mean, of course, we'll ask you where that they can find you in your book and all those kinds of things. But
wherever we go is great.
Okay.
Looking forward to being part of this conversation.
It might be a random ride.
That's just great. Wherever it goes is good. Random is good too.
Okay.
Good.
All right. Well,
all right.
You wanna clap us off, Steve?
Yeah, we'll do that. All right. 3, 2.
Steve Gallagher, how are you today, my friend?
Matthew Hewitt, good to see you, buddy, as always.
Yeah. Hey, I'm really excited about today. We have a guest with us, and his name is Brian D. McLaren. It may be or may not be passwords to everything that is pertinent in my life. Brian, thanks for coming on. We're excited to have you this afternoon.
So glad to be with you guys on the podcast with maybe the most interesting name of any podcast.
We did it, Matt.
Yes. All right. So for our listeners and our friends out there, just a couple of things before we get into the conversation with Brian, and that is Brian has been, for those of you who know me, one of the most influential, if not the most influential voice in my formation. So if you've had me as a student or a congregant, then you've heard his name, and you're probably like, finally, maybe he can get this off his bucket list and move on. But Brian, I did want to just start off by thanking you for that. I consider you a great bridger or synthesizer. You often take the really Ivy League academic high stuff up there, and you use your skills with metaphors and with imagery, and put it into a place where it has Velcro, and I can hang on to it. And so for that, I'm really appreciative. And we're excited to have you on. Steve has heard about you forever.
20 plus years. Yeah.
He has almost every book on his of yours on his bookshelf that I've bought for him. I don't know that he's read any of them other than this one.
This is gold. And I'm holding up for our audience. I'm holding up the new book, Do I Stay Christian, which comes out in a week or two. Is that right?
Yeah, May 24th. That's right.
Awesome. Right. And so this was my first read, and it was I don't know if you can see the note cards. Just flip through there in the dog-eared pages. But yeah, this was a treat, and for it to be my first read and to then get to have this conversation with you today, I count myself very thankful. So, yeah.
Yeah, you've been missing out for a long time.
I have. Yeah, and this was Brian, to give you context, when Matt says that we've come from different ends of the ideological spectrum on things at times, that has been the history of our friendship. Is me often saying to Matt, and friends in ministry would say to him, hey, you're usually 5 to 10 years ahead of the curve. Come back and tell us what it looks like so that we can be prepared. And so when Matt would share these thoughts, I think of generous orthodoxy and some of the earlier works, and he would come in and it would have me banging my head against the wall, only for 5 years later for me to be saying something similar to that. And he's like, McLaren says this. Have you not read what I gave you? But that's been the role of us in each other's lives. And so having that friendship to bounce things off of, to argue and still love each other with, but then to end up on the same path is part of our history there. But yeah, so I'm, again, glad I got to be a part of this.
So, Brian, the last few books of yours, The Great Spiritual Migration, and then Faith After Doubt, and now this book, which is Do I Stay Christian, a Guide for the Doubters, Disappointed, the Disillusioned, seem to have taken a pretty major shift in your writing. Not that you weren't building up to it, but rather than me try to describe it in its format, could you just tell our listeners what they can look forward to, the structure, what your point is in this book, and then we'll get into some questions and details. Sure.
Well, maybe to just make a very quick connection between those three books that you mentioned, Matt. Great Spiritual Migration, I was talking about this, the image of migration having the idea of movement, that there seems to be a movement of people who are uncomfortable with the status quo in a lot of our religious institutions, and they're not willing to just stay there. They have to move. Faith After Doubt describes the one way to understand that movement is in terms of spiritual stages of spiritual development. And I tried to present a very simple framework for spiritual development. I synthesized the work of a lot of really smart people. And I talked about simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony, these 4 stages. Well, when you take that as kind of a backdrop, the fact is, a lot of our congregations, rather than doing, Steve, what you talked about maybe, some people are moving at a certain pace now and other people will come along in 5 years. I think a lot of our congregations are seeing other people move forward, and they're actually putting the car in reverse. And their response is not even digging in their heels. It's saying, we're going to go back to some models and ways of behaving and thinking that haven't been seen for a generation or many generations. And so what that's doing is kind of pulling the fabric apart and increasing the polarization.
Right.
And so what ends up happening is those people who are moving forward, many of them wonder if Christianity is moving backward, and I'm moving forward, is there even room for me to be a Christian anymore? And so that question, do I stay Christian? I think all of us are hearing it being asked all around us, obviously by younger people who are wondering, do they want to be part of the kind of religion their parents are demonstrating? But it's even happening among a lot of older people who feel that they just don't fit in anymore. And as people grow, when I talked about those 4 stages, especially when they move into the 3rd and 4th stages that I call perplexity and harmony, they just wonder, are there any Christian congregations where a person like me is even wanted or welcome? So that creates this deep sense of religious identity crisis. And that in many ways is what I'm trying to help people do in this book. And maybe the last thing I'll say is, I think a lot of people would see that title and they would think that what I'm doing is trying to persuade people to stay Christian and give them arguments that say why they should stay Christian. But that's really not what I'm trying to do in the book. I'm trying to do something very different that we can get into and talk about.
That's actually a spoiler alert that I was going to mention. Was you get to the end of this to find out that there's not what I would consider maybe the typical Christian in
bait and switch
question, right? Like, hey, we're here to convert you, excuse me, and for you to hold it so loosely, right? Like at the end, not to jump all the way to the end of the book, but you hold it so loosely there. And I don't know, especially folks who were raised in evangelical fundamentalist communities, churches, that they are comfortable or familiar with you being so comfortable with, hey, if you choose to not stay, that's okay. And so thank you for giving us that permission. That was.
I thought you said you didn't want to jump to the end of the book. Still.
Right. Well, and yeah. So all right. So the interview's done. Yeah. And Brian, our typical, I don't want to say typical, but a lot of the comments that we have from our listeners is they're finding themselves in this place of this very question. Yeah. And so former students of ours, when we worked together at the Christian University, who are now in ministry roles and have uprooted their families and moved overseas and to be a part of a movement only for a scandal to hit, for wounds that were never addressed, that were done at the hands of maybe leaders in ministry or in the church. Those are our friends in our community, and part of our goal has been to continue being there for them regardless of what their decision is.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's interesting. Near the beginning of the book, I tell a story about a friend who I just happened to see. I haven't seen him in close to 20 years, and I just happened to see him a few weeks ago and got to tell him that I included this story in the book. But when I was in college, in undergraduate years in university, I was going through a deep period of doubt, and I confided to this friend who had become kind of a mentor to me. He was, 5 or so years older than me. I confided to him that I wasn't sure I believed in God anymore. And he said to me, well, Brian, if you decide you don't believe in God anymore, it won't affect our friendship. I'm your friend no matter what.
Yeah.
And what happened to me at that moment is I don't think I'd ever had any Christian friend who would have said that to me up until that point. And here's the irony. At that moment, God became easier to believe in, because what he just did is he modeled to me an unconditional love. And I think part of what my disillusionment with all the ideas of God that were given to me is that they were so conditional. In other words, the God that they presented me with was more petty and less forgiving and less accepting and less understanding than any friend I would trust.
Right.
And so I was having trouble believing in that God. And the irony was his unconditional love. I just said, I'm not sure I believe in God anymore. And as soon as he said, I'm your friend no matter what, I was like, well, maybe there's a God after all.
That's beautiful.
Good. Well, since I took us to the end of the book, I'll pull us back to the front, and I'll say,
good job.
Yeah, see, you like how I segued there? Right off, I mean, the first page of the first chapter, you waste no time, and you touch on something that, on that same note, that part of our community, myself included, and others, are wrestling with, they don't want to give their children the lens for God that they were given.
Yeah.
And so you find yourself at this in between place of, am I doing this right? How am I screwing my kid up? Every parent says we do a great job of screwing our kids up. For you, and you touch on this in chapter 1, but what advice would you have to that parent today, whether it's talking to younger Brian and you talk about the letter that you wrote to your kids? What advice would you have to that young parent, or in my case, old parent? I have a 12-year-old daughter, and she says, I don't know if I believe in God. And I say to her, hey, that's okay.
Yeah.
What advice would you have to that parent?
Yeah. Well, first, I'm really glad you raised that question. When of course I've been out public speaking less during COVID, but in my public speaking, probably over the last 7 or 10 years, that's the most common question I get asked. Like wherever I go, what do I teach my kids? And the first thing I would say is, I think it's a good idea for all of us who grew up in the church to have some honest conversations. We can have them internally, just reflect on this, but sometimes it helps to sit around the table with a few other folks and say, what in my religious upbringing was helpful and what has ended up hurting me. Let me can I give a quick example of this?
Absolutely.
So I was a Christian kid going to a Christian summer camp. And I think I was 8 or 9 years old. And one night after dinner, as it was getting dark, they told us to all get our flashlights. We walk through the woods through this long, scary trail in the darkness. We come to this big open area. There's a bonfire waiting. We gather around the bonfire. My first thought is, oh, cool, we're going to have marshmallows. A preacher gets up and he starts saying, you're going to go to hell unless you accept Jesus, and see how hot that fire is. And you're going to be thrown in a fire. And you're never, like, when I look back at that now, to me, this feels like child abuse. Like,
yes,
how could you do any kind of terrifying thing? But here's the thing I remember I didn't take it seriously. Like, I just knew, I already, by the age of 8 or 9, I knew that this is a routine that Christians do to try to get people to say something called the sinner's prayer. Like, I already knew not to take it seriously. But here's what terrifies me. What about the kid who didn't grow up in a Christian family, or the very sensitive kid who wasn't used to this? Like, that is traumatizing. So I think we ought to have really honest conversations about what in our upbringing. There's this huge reconsideration about how and what we were taught about our sexuality, right?
Yeah.
right.
For me, I was taught nothing. Like, we just never mentioned sexuality.
Yeah.
But I think in more recent years, there's all of this hyper talk about sexuality that I think causes people lifelong damage. I remember the first time as a pastor, I had a couple come to see me when they got back from their honeymoon to tell me that they were unable to consummate their marriage because the wife had been given so much guilt about sex that she wasn't able, in her church and especially in her youth group, that she wasn't able to say, what I've been told is sinful is now okay. Right. She just, her body wouldn't go along with that, And so all that's to say, I think the first thing is parents ought to have some honest conversations. And then the second thing is, I would say, if you are part of a church that you think is going to hurt your kids, I would find a different church, even though that might cause a lot of disruption. I would not want to put my kids through, that sort of thing.
Go ahead, Matt.
That's been one of my most, I was a youth pastor. I was a children's pastor for just a short time in my early 20s. And as a senior pastor, youth pastor, I've always kind of dealt with that. But it was in my 40s making this move to North Carolina when I became a families pastor again at a church here. And I was amazed at the curriculum.
Yeah.
I was amazed that so much time of my week was spent altering children's curriculum.
Yeah.
Because for some reason we think kids at the age of 5 or 6 need the full Bible taught to them and taught as inerrant and infallible and placed on, instead of a Trinity, it's a quartet now. But I just I'm fascinated because I don't have kids myself, that I don't know where that comes from, except such an allegiance to the word, as my Pentecostal forefathers would say. But anyway, Steve, I cut you off. What were
No,
you
you're
going to
good.
say?
So Matt and I we were both raised in the Assemblies of God. Matt in rural Alabama, me in a coal mining community in Western Virginia, not to be confused with West Virginia. Matt always jokes about that. But we were raised in that.
You did say wrestling.
I did say wrestling, yes.
You did.
So that's different. But both of us being raised in rural Appalachia, and going through that, the images of exactly what you just described of going to the bonfire, like we knew how to cue the tape. We were also both pleasers, right? Yeah. So it was checking the boxes. It was when the missionary comes to church, you're called to go to Africa at 12 years old, you go up. One neat experience that I'll share on that note that made me think of it. So being raised Pentecostal, right? There's the speaking in tongues point of it. And my daughter was about, I guess, 10 years old, and Matt was visiting. This was last year. Been a year ago. And my daughter is not, and I say this with no energy around it. My daughter is not a fan of church. And so it's, oh my gosh, I'm the kid who went through all of this, and yet I'm still screwed up. She's to the other extreme. But randomly one night, she looks at Matt sitting on the couch. Hey, Uncle Matt, you speak in tongues? And Matt looks at me and he says, yeah.
You gonna do this now?
Yeah. And she goes, and so she looks and says, let me hear what you got. Now, she's not been raised in church, right? Yes. Like she's outside of this. And Matt goes, are you okay with this? And Brian, in that moment, I couldn't help but get emotional.
Yeah.
Because that's the part of God that I want her to see. I don't want it to be the guy on the platform.
Yeah.
I don't want it to be that person, but I want it to be in that natural community.
Yeah.
And so Matt says in that moment, are we going to do this? And I said, absolutely. Yeah. And so Matt, just kind of prays prays a prayer in the spirit in tongues. And so he stops and she's like, oh, okay. And then she just walks off and he goes, what just happened? I said, I don't know, but I'm so thankful for it. Yes. Right? Like that's what and that's the permission that I think that we need to give young parents.
Yes.
To say, be okay with it. Be okay with the questions that your kid has. Be okay with the awkwardness. So many times we forget they're just reflecting ourselves back to us. I learned that early on, but yeah, that was a piece.
Yeah, you want to talk about awkward? That was, I do a lot of work with awkwardness. I think it's a beautiful thing, but that was different. So I was going to say to you about that fire pit incident. Yeah. I would have been the kid because I had already responded at maybe the age of 3 to that fire message. Yeah. So I'm looking around like, yep, you're going. Yep, you're going to split it wide open. You better get right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we've come hopefully our understanding has grown and our view of God is bigger, or hopefully we're in the process of setting God free, as you say later in the book. Yeah. So, go ahead, Steve.
Brian, what was for you, and you kind of touched on it in that answer, but what was your earliest memory? What was the lens that you were given? And what was your earliest memory of asking that question of, wait a minute, I don't know if it was the college story that you shared, if it was being around the fire that evening.
The Do I Stay Christian?
Yeah. Like, what was that first thread that you started pulling on?
Yeah, I think it was evolution, because I was super interested in science. Like, I love to learn about the stars, and I love to learn about volcanoes, and I love to learn about plate tectonics, but evolution was super, super interesting to me, because I read all these books about animals, and they were sort of science books. They all took evolution for granted. And I remember when I asked my parents about it, because I was paying attention in church, and they were talking about a literal 6-day creation. And I remember 2 things. I remember my Sunday school teacher said, you can either believe in God or you can believe in evolution. And so I just had this little click in my brain. okay, how I can't remember exactly how old I was,
Yeah.
somewhere between 11 and 14. Let's say I was 13,
Okay.
So I'm thinking, okay, I'm 13 years old, 5 more years and I'm out of here.
Yeah.
But I also talked to my mother about it. And my mother gave me, really an ideal answer. She said, well, some people think you have to take that literally. Some people don't. And so
Wow.
what she did is she gave me permission for
Right.
different options. Now, when I actually started thinking evolution was a better explanation, she was a little nervous, I think, but still the fact that she gave me options, that helped. But it was at a young age.
That seems to be a theme with you, that you had these critical points along your journey, right?
Yeah.
Where somebody, that influential moment was somebody holding it so loosely
Yeah.
that it gave you permission to question that. And we don't see that today. We don't see, or we didn't see it in our generation. And I don't know how much we see it today, but yeah, that's,
It was interesting. Yesterday, I had this exact conversation with my class. I moved up here, and the school approached me and asked me if I wanted to become a high school science teacher. So I said, well, I haven't had a science class since 1994, but I like science. I love science. And so yesterday, we had to, it didn't have to, I got to start our unit on evolution. And you can imagine in rural Western North Carolina, the kids I have in my classes. So that's what I did. I actually gave them my story. Here I am, a pastor. I'm also a strong believer in evolution, not intelligent design, but evolution. And I said, I walked around the room and I said, called them by name. And I said, do you have my permission to disagree with me?
Mm.
Just know why you do. That's all I
Yes.
ask.
That's great. That's
and
great.
A lot of that comes from the way that this book and so many other books that you write are very both and.
Mm.
We talk about
Yes.
that a lot. Steve and I talk about being
transcend
both
and
and
include,
rather
both
than
and,
either
yeah.
or. And you do. I do think you go further than you ever have in this particular book, explicitly saying that.
Yeah.
That hey, I'm interested in us being the best humans we can be.
Yeah.
And I think it was in Finding Our Way Again that you talked about. It's fun to have read your books and see the seeds here and there. And I've always wondered if were you already there and you were planting the seed knowing in book 9, I'm going to extrapolate on this, or if that has been a shift in your views as you've moved along, because I remember you talking about your was it Peter Senge?
Yeah.
That you were mentioning in regards to why Buddhism rather than Christianity, and he's like, because it teaches you a way to live, and Christianity only teaches you what to believe. And so you talk about that here, failure of transformation.
Yes.
So I'm curious as to that progression in you as an author, because I really do feel like this is such a clear you talk about a coming out of sorts of the message that I've seen building.
Yeah.
So has that been a progression for you, or has that been what we all know, that you can only take people as far as they can go?
Yeah.
And you've been strategic.
I think it's a little bit of both, to be honest. So there's another both and, but it's an honest answer.
Sure.
And some of that has to do with me, some of that has to do with my audience, and some of that has to do with the times. But there are parts of this where I definitely have my own thinking has continued to take steps forward.
Right.
When you think about any journey, there's stuff up around the next corner that you can't see until you get to the corner.
Right.
And so that's certainly true in many ways for me. And we could, if you wanted to talk about any specific examples, I'd be happy to talk about them. But there's another piece of this that you just said very well, that you have to meet people where they are, and you have to take them in their next adjacent step. Most people can't take 10 steps at a time. They can take a step or two. And so I've had this sense of who my audience is. And one way to say this, Matt, is to say, if I could go back, if I went back and had a conversation with me in 2001, I wrote a book called A New Kind of Christian, where in many ways, all of the ideas that I'm still writing about were there in a kind of latent form. If I went back to 2001 and I were to say how much my audience has changed in these 21 years,
right.
My audience has changed way, way, way faster than I expected. Like, honestly, the things I wrote about in 2001, I thought I would be dead before people were ready to accept any of them. And what's happened is things have been accelerated for a whole bunch of reasons, much faster than I expected. So, yeah,
we're in a time of exponential growth, not just simple addition. To speak to that, I so much of my journey, I was a kid out of Bible college, in my first pastorate, out after undergrad, and was walking into one of those Baptist family shepherd type Christian bookstores. And I was disillusioned. I was disillusioned with the church. I was very much steeped in part one of this book, why I might leave the faith. And I walked in, and there was a dollar bin, book bin, and I picked up 2 books that day for $2 in tax.
Only 2.
And for me, which was amazing.
That's
but I was broke back then too. But I grabbed Soul Tsunami by Leonard Sweet and A New Kind of Christian.
That's a good combination, I'd say.
Oh my gosh. Within a week, I didn't know what to do with myself. No one around me knew what to do with me. And it started me on a pretty strong journey. In fact, for those of you who are new to Brian, you're going to read this book based on this or other things you're hearing about it. One of the best things you can do is just build your library off the footnote sections of his books. I have certain people in my life, authors who I consider name droppers. Madeline Lingual was one, of course, others, but you're one of those guys who put me in touch with people, and Steve, and then wonder why I was ahead of the people in my denomination, but I was simply just reading your footnotes and buying the books that you had referenced. And so I'm really appreciative of that. But so we talk a lot about the things that you deal with in part one of this book, why you might leave. We also are pretty open with where we're at, Steve and I, and our attendance in the church. I'm pastoring. He's not really attending a place right now. We're working into those things. The second part of this book and the third part of this book give me great hope for how to move forward and what to give. But before we get into any of that, because I know our time's coming to a close pretty soon, I want to make sure I get this question in. For those who have already said no to Christianity, but through reading this book or another book, what they realize they've said no to is a constricted form of Christianity, not the fullness of what that means historically and all those pieces. How can they best go about reentry?
Yeah, I would just say with great caution, because people who've left have good reasons for leaving.
Right.
Almost always. I can't even remember meeting anyone who had a bad reason for leaving.
Right.
And it would be very easy to be re-traumatized because as the first part of the book explores, it's very hard to find a part of the Christian faith, a community of the Christian faith that has taken seriously our history and has really done what you do in Alcoholics Anonymous, where you have a searching and fearless moral inventory about the harm that you've done. And so that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is maybe start start safe. And what I mean by that is, listening to a podcast is one of the things that people do as a first step. You're alone in your car, the doors are locked, you're moving at 65 miles an hour, nobody knows what you're listening to, and you're able to listen to conversations that if the people at your church knew, or the people, if you were to go back to church, they might be horrified that you're listening to that conversation. So I would say occupy the safe places first.
Okay.
And then you might find out, hey, there's this group of people, that a small group of people that have a meeting, or there's this other, there, for example, there's some people have heard of the Wild Goose Festival. So for some people, instead of going to church 1 week a year, 1 hour a week for a year, once a year, they go for 4 or 5 days somewhere, and they're around people where there's a good bit more freedom. And but then if you do find a community that you feel is relatively safe, then what I'd say is, first, cherish that. Second, don't expect it to be perfect, because even if it's way better than what you left, it won't be perfect. Every group has problems. And the third thing I'd say is, if there is a safe place, cherish it and appreciate it. And realize that anybody who's occupying that space is taking risks to do so, because they're getting hammered by all the people who are telling them they're doing it wrong.
Wow, that's good. I appreciate that. And I know Steve and I have a lot of friends that will probably be unpacking just what you said with them about. Let me ask a couple of more pieces here, if you don't mind. You do something that when I think of Maltman, or I think of Chardin, I think I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
And I know I'm saying this wrong, and it's not because I haven't looked up how to pronounce the name, but is it Ilia
Delio?
Delio.
Yeah.
Delio. With this idea of Christianity is in its infancy.
Yes.
Perhaps.
Yes.
I think that's really difficult for those of us who have been a part of this for a while, and who maybe we don't know the term first axial age, but we're definitely, that's our stick. That's our, what we swim in, our embryonic fluid. Can you say just a little bit, a foretaste for them of what you mean by leaving that Christianity, as long as these other religions might be in its infancy, and instead of looking from the back propelling forward, how do we look forward in the anticipatory manner you talked about?
Yeah. Well, I want to apologize in advance for the folks who might be offended by what I'm about to say, but one of the downsides of biblical literalism, when you believe in a 6,000-year-old earth or whatever, is you have this very short time frame. And especially if you expect the earth to end any minute, then you have this sort of time frame that this is all about human beings, it's all about religion, it's all about us, and it's all about going to heaven when you die. But when you allow science to get a word in edgewise, and you realize, if we're talking about a 14 billion year old universe, that's a really long time. And if you condense that into one day, I talk about this at the end of the book, human beings come along at the last second of the, if you can condense all of history into 1 year, human beings come along at the last second of, the last day. So we're just a very new species. And when you think about how long we've had the capacity for language, language is very, very new. And when you think about religion as we know it, very, very new phenomenon. And then you realize, even if you just look at the 2,000 years of Christian history, this is a secret that's kept from a lot of people, but I'm telling the truth, and people can check me up on this. Christianity has changed a lot over these 2,000 years. So if we acknowledge that everything is in flux, everything's changing, and that the time frames are very, very big, then what we could say is, Christianity is kind of an adolescent or elementary school religion. It hasn't figured out what it's really about yet. It's had a lot of surges forward and setbacks. And gosh, when you study history and Christian history,
Right.
and you look at what's going on in the United States today, like this is an old story. Gosh, I was just reading in the last couple of weeks, about 100 years ago, we were going through something called prohibition, where these Christians got together over decades. They got fired up to say, all of our problems are because of alcohol. And so they got a constitutional amendment to make alcohol illegal. It became an experiment that lasted 13 years and turned out to be a failure. They found out that when you make alcohol illegal, you actually empower organized crime and you make more people become criminals. And that has all kinds of other consequences. But here's the interesting thing. All those Christians spent decades being obsessed about alcohol, and they cared nothing about lynchings, where white people were lynching Black people. And they cared nothing about segregation. And they cared nothing about voter suppression. And then you realize, oh, to be obsessed. So you look at what's happening in today's world and you say, gosh, we're doing a repeat of 100 years ago.
Yeah. So that leads me to this next point then, which was you talk about something in this book, and you reference Nadia Boltz and others, but you talk about the idea of purity. What is it? Cult of innocence.
Cult of innocence. Yeah.
Cult of innocence. And I'm wondering if you were able to be prescient enough to anticipate what would be happening with Roe v. Wade right now.
Yeah.
When you were writing this, and I'm curious, as again, this is a complicated issue, and Steve and I, my wife and I, loads of people are on different places on this. But could you explain a little bit what you mean by that, and what you mean specifically in regards to the abortion issue?
So this is one of those things in this book that I felt really good about. I felt like I finally got to put into words something I've not been able to capture for a long time. And I guess I could say it like this: after a lifetime of living in religious settings, I've become more attuned to the role that shame plays in religion. Preachers shame us. Preachers, they get a reaction from us by finding the places where they can sort of poke us most tenderly and cause us the most pain. And it's easy for them because they get somebody to walk down the aisle and they get people to cry. But they don't realize the accumulation of that amount of shame over weeks and months and years has all kinds of unintended consequences. And one of the consequences is people want a shortcut out of shame. And what preachers do is they say, oh, Jesus removes your guilt. Jesus removes your shame. Maybe so, but then the preacher brings it back the next week for another reason.
Puts it right back on. Right.
Yeah. And so I think one of the things that happens is people who are subjected to a lot of shame need a shortcut to innocence. And there are two ways to have a shortcut to innocence, as I see it. And maybe there are more too, but two primary ways that I see at work in my own life and in the religious experience of people I've been close to. The first is you find an innocent victim to latch onto. And when you defend the innocent victim, you get a transfusion of innocence from the victim. And you feel better about yourself because you stood up for this innocent victim. And then whoever is oppressing that innocent victim, you see as filthy and vile and evil and satanic and horrible. And now you feel superior to an enemy that you've now identified. When you put those two together, the innocence derived from the victim and the innocence derived from the villain, that's a very powerful, almost addictive kind of innocence. The only problem is, like an addiction, you constantly need to up your dosage.
Yeah.
And I look back on my experience. I marched in the very early years of the pro-life movement.
Sure.
I had my kids in their strollers in Washington, D.C. But I look back and I have to say, I really didn't think much about abortion. I just wanted to be a good person. And people I trusted told me this is what good people do. But when I look at the fruit of the pro-life movement, I'm being honest. I'm not
Right.
condemning anybody. I was sincere when I was there. I wanted to do the right thing. I'm not questioning anybody's sincerity, but I look, and what I realize is on January 6, 2021, when I saw all these Christians holding up Jesus, wearing Jesus t-shirts, holding up Bibles and chanting to kill Mike Pence. And
One of their own.
Exactly right.
Until that moment.
I said, there is something sick that has happened, an unintended consequence. And I think this cult of innocence leads in the directions that most cults lead. It leads to somebody dying. And frankly, it's always dangerous to bring this out, but I also think it needs to be mentioned that what was happening, about 100 years ago is we're very close to the time when a young German guy took over a political party in Germany and ended up becoming the Führer. And he knew the magic sauce of giving people somebody to blame, a villain, a dirty villain to blame for all of our problems. And that gave the shamed German psyche, the German psyche that had been shamed by World War I.
Right.
It gave them a shortcut to innocence.
Wow.
And it leads to ugly, ugly places. People find themselves doing things of unspeakable cruelty, and they can't even see it because all they see themselves in is shares in innocence. So sorry, that was a little sermon, but
no,
yeah.
that's
really
what I
good.
was hoping for. So you've got a point in this book. I'll just throw a couple of things out that I appreciate: the announce and renounce piece. I'm trying to figure out how to do that. I'm now, of course, a white, straight, cis male living in Cherokee. My school. 30% of our students or more are part of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indian. How to factor that? In fact, it's a lot easier for me to be pro Black Lives Matter, even though there's huge repercussions here. But it's easy because we have a very, very small African American population historically where I'm at.
Yeah,
it's much easier to do that than it is to do the hard work of announcing and renouncing when it comes to the Native American folk that I'm with every day.
Yes.
And I think part of that is because I'm dealing with my own transfusion of innocence.
Yes.
It's easier to defend the folks that aren't here. With that said, you also have this beautiful point in the third part of the book that nothing is thrown away.
Yeah.
So you just mentioned, you were talking about maybe the most hot button topic that we have. And for so many of us, it's not just our churches that are divided, it's our families with people on one side of the political aisle and the other, and the infusion of American Jesus and what others would say. How do you do that? And I know you've talked about this in a lot of other places, but just a short piece on how do I, in the midst of this, and I know what you're going to say because I've read the book, but what is the key to being able to separate myself from those things without dehumanizing the people who hold the views that I find so important?
Yeah. Well, so let me just say on that issue of abortion that we just talked about, you'll notice that I said nothing about my opinions about abortion.
Right.
Because the issue of abortion isn't, we could almost put that aside.
Right.
It's what is being done and used in the name of the issue of abortion that becomes deeply, deeply concerning to me. But if I could offer a little simple script that could help people, here it is. Wow, I see things differently. 5 words. Wow, I see, or wow, I see that differently.
Right.
So I hear someone say a bigoted statement about Muslims or about Native Americans or about whatever. And if I say you're a bigot, you're an idiot, well, what I've just done is I've added a little more antagonism in the world. If I'm silent, I've complicitly my silence adds power to that statement. So what I need is a way to counter the statement without adding to the vitriol in the world. And so what I found is the best way to do it is for me to take a risk and to say, wow, I see that differently. Wow, there's some emotion here.
Right.
I'm not going to talk about you. I'm not going to say you're wrong. I'm going to define myself. I see that differently. Now, almost always when people ask me, what do you mean you see that differently? If it's in public, I will almost every chance I get, I will say, I'd rather not go into it now. I just want you to know I see it differently. If you want to ask me another time, we could talk about it another time. The reason I do that is because almost nobody has the humility to change their mind in public. If you confront them in public, they're going to defend themselves. So if they want to come and talk to me in private, we can have a private conversation. But in public, it's just asking too much. Plus, and this gets back to really the heart of your question. If I could say to you, wow, I see that differently. It's what you two do in your friendship. You say we are at the same place on everything. It doesn't affect our friendship. We still love each other. I'm saying I don't have to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong for our friendship to be continuing. It's just not even that big a deal whether you agree with me or not. What's the big deal is I need to express that I see that differently. So,
and one thing I would say, Brian, that I appreciated and I wanted to say thank you for is the grace that is woven throughout this book, the tenderness, where in a day that everyone's standing on their side of the street, yelling, living in their echo chambers, the amount of grace and tenderness that, regardless of where you fall on any political ideals or wherever, there's such an amount here that I think is missing today, and that's something that that I get a little nervous about. Like, man, how can we get any more divided? Okay, then how do we, if it's me and my community, Matt and his, or together through Whistle Pig and the Bear, is how do we model that? And so I wanted to say before we jumped off the call that I appreciated your tone and tenor throughout that, and it meant a lot. It went a long way with me.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that. It really is a dangerous time that we're in. Later in that chapter, it's called Reconsecrate Everything. I start off with a quote from Annie Leonard that there is no away. We can't throw anything away. And Dr. King expressed this so well. He said, look, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but if you have a person who you identify as your enemy, you can't throw your enemy away unless you want to kill your enemy. But here's the thing. If you oppose your enemy because your enemy is bad, and so you decide to kill him, you just became bad too. And so Dr. King said, really the only way to get rid of an enemy is to win him over as a friend. And that, I think, is at the heart of Jesus' teaching when he tells us to love our enemies. He's telling us you can't just throw people away, of course. And then he goes on to say, because God actually loves that enemy of yours as God's own child. And so if you actually want to be like God, then you better learn how to have the same grace that God has. And God basically says, I'm going to let the rain fall on everybody. I'm going to let the sun shine on everybody. I'm going to be generous because that's who I am. Not because this person deserves it more or that person deserves it more. So that, to me, is one of the things that keeps me Christian, is because I think that vision of Jesus, of God, Jesus' vision of God, that invites me to be a better person, and that helps us get out of the mess that we're in right now.
Good.
Yeah, I think I think you quoted it, that King said that we have an inescapable web of mutuality.
Yes.
And that also goes into, you referenced some beautiful people, Richard Rohr and Rob Bell, some different folks, the mystical folks who ring so true to my Pentecostal nature.
Yes.
Throughout history, they all have this idea of wanting.
Yes.
Steve's got Steve and I found actually the out of copy prints of wanting
that's great.
the other day, but I want to say thank you to that as well. I said this to you once before, that the story that comes to my mind when I think of you and your reading more often than not is the Inquisitor that Dostoevsky talks about, and in that I have seen for you, along with a lot of others, basically take the insults and the blows and the cannon fire, and I'm sure behind closed doors and in your conversations with your family and with God, you may let it out, but you have modeled what it is to be gracious and to not turn those who want to vilify into the other. And I appreciate that about you. And I think you have, I know to me, but to so many, you have been our pastor through your writing, through your videos, through your podcasts, and just your presence. And so I wanted to make sure we said a deep thank you for helping form so many of us. And I'm really, I know I finished the book yesterday, but I'm really excited about the next book. So I wonder, do you know what you're going to be talking on next? What's down the road?
Well, there are two options, I should say.
Yeah.
Before I need to go, but the first option, I've written a science fiction novel that I'm hoping my publisher will be interested in, called The Last Voyage. And then the next book that I'm planning is called The Beautiful Logic of a Meaningful Life. And I want to write a book about what goes into a meaningful life. So we'll see what unfolds.
That sounds great.
You remind me in some ways, Rob Bell is all about titles, like the magic of titles, and your titles, even on that second one there, just
thanks.
Yeah, really.
Thanks.
Good stuff. Well, Matt, let's honor Brian's time.
Yeah.
And know that he's got to go. Do you want to close us out with?
Yeah, I'll just say it again. Life is hard and life is great. And it's not meant to be done alone. So for those of you out here who don't have someone close to you, find someone and develop a friendship, develop those strong bonds. And for many, many of you, you might want to start with Brian's books. He can be a friend to you from afar. And I can't tell you, I kind of go into a Brian McLaren book like I go into Marvel movies. I don't want to expect too much because I don't want to be let down, but I always do expect a whole lot. And unlike Marvel movies, Brian doesn't disappoint. He always gives me more than I look forward to. So Brian, thank you once again for your time, for your work, and again, for God, whatever that means, the animating attention of the universe, the ground of being. Thank you for showing us how to start with the heart and showing us how to love.
Thanks, guys. So good to be with you. Thanks for your good work on this podcast.
Thanks.
All right.
Good stuff. Brian,
Brian.
Will you be at Wild Goose this year?
I thought I wasn't going to be able to be there because I have to be in Canada, but I am going to be there the first night and the first morning. So I'm happy about that. So hopefully I'll see you guys.
Yeah, we'll be recording there. So.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll see you in a couple months.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I got to run.
No, you're good. You're good. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, how you feel?
Like I need to smoke a cigarette. Are we still recording? We are, right?
Yes.
That's good. I'm all right with that. I'm all right with our listeners.
Yes.
Guys, I tried to be subtle with my fanboyism, but I'm afraid it did not come through.
It eked out. Fanboy eked out, and I loved it.
Hey, that was I just hope he felt good about it because I felt real good about it.
That ties in with your smoking of a cigarette. I hope it was good for him as it was for me.
That's what I mean. No. again, I can't tell you guys, and maybe that's it, but I really don't have anyone's works who have so affected me. And in part, it's because he reads so widely. He was an English teacher before he
Yeah.
was a church planner. And whether it's been fiction books or whether it's been nonfiction, I mean, he has put me on to Walker Percy. He put me on to Rene Girard. He put me on to Ilia Delio. He put me on to Daniel Quinn.
Did he put you on to, gosh, now I'm going to draw a blank. Oh, the scientist. Oh, I'm still blanking out.
Chardin?
No,
You did.
Ken Wilber. Did he put you on the Ken
Yeah,
Wilber?
yeah. He was one of the, it
Yeah.
was one of the first books I ever read. So I was teaching and getting in trouble for teaching integral theory and spiral dynamics. My very first class as a teacher, which would have been, I think, 2003.
Yeah.
Gabe Stoudemire, if you're listening, can verify. He's like, "What are you doing?"
That was 0304. I remember you coming in. I had an 8-foot dry erase board in my office, and you came in and just started unpacking it, and your hair was on fire.
Yeah, and so just over and over again, and he does a good job with this book in particular, guys, in that he lists it. He puts a whole page of podcasts and a whole page of authors that you should look into.
Yeah.
And what I really have appreciated, and something that he alluded to, is how fast change has happened.
Mm-hmm.
That he was saying things that he thought wouldn't resonate, but they did. And so many of the people that he mentions are not white males. They're queer, or they are indigenous, or they are Latino or Latinx, or they are African American women.
There was a piece in there which I've erred on the side of not giving the church, capital C, the grace and everything that would entail. My word for the day is grace, I guess. But how far the church has come in its history, and then especially in the past 10 to 15 years, what the growth that we've seen there, where I've erred on the side of only seeing it from this limited perspective experience that I've had, and go, no, wait a minute, we have come a long way. Like, this thing has come. So we don't have a lot of work to do, but yeah, it's come a long way.
So again, both and, right? He's got a chapter in here. What is it called? Why would I leave a church that is both growing and, he doesn't say screwing itself up, but he says, why would I leave a church? Because Christianity. Why would he stay in it? Because Christianity is changing. And then in parentheses, which, by the way, Brian McLaren is the king of parenthetical talk, for the worse and for the better. And he put me onto someone who was instrumental in getting his message out there, who was the late great Phyllis Tickle.
Oh,
and
yeah.
That's a real name. That's not one I made up. But she talked about in her book, The Great Emergence, this idea of gathering around the center.
Mm-hmm.
More and more people are becoming what she called hyphenates.
Okay.
So because of technology,
I'm all about a hyphen.
Yeah, because of podcasts, because of the internet, because of these pieces, I can no longer just be in my enclave of Southern Baptist or Assemblies of God. So you've got Baptists practicing Lectio Divina. You've got Catholics who are speaking in tongues. You've got all of these different pieces happening. But what happens is there are people who are more committed to their way of religion than they are to the truth. And they fear that heresy is seeping into their quadrant of the deal. So at one point, simultaneously, you have people from different denominations within Christianity, and you could also say this about faith circles in general, who are gathering around the center, sharing in common vocabulary, practices, theological concerns, and words. the same time, within that block, whether you're a renewalist or you are a mainline social active kind of gospel, or a smells and bells kind of
Smells and
liturgical
bells.
smells and bells.
What's that?
That's high church.
Yeah, that's
A
what.
lot of candles, incense, bells.
Got it.
In each of those quadrants, you have a greater divide. Because like he said, they're not just digging their heels in, they're putting the car in reverse, because I'm afraid of losing my Pentecostal distinctive if all of a sudden I start following the
And doesn't that sound like the cisgender white male, 50 plus years old, who looks at the census forecast? We're going to be a minority in 10 years.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
So you could extend the idea of white fragility to Christian fragility or denominational fragility. And there becomes the denomination that I left as an ordained minister. I can remember before I did being in the general council and the superintendent, the general
global conference
for the entire Assemblies of God, at least the American, says, and we will be the watchdogs, talking about the LGBTQ community. And I know what it is to have doctrinal, what was the name of it? I'm trying not to make this up. It's probably worse than what I'm going to say it is, but I think it was the Doctrinal Purity Committee that was meeting. I mean, it sounds like something off of Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, it does. That's exactly what my brain went.
But it's there. I mean, it's just, so we live in a world of great, great despair and a world of great hope. And what I would encourage you is to read this book with as unbiased eyes as you can see, and maybe read it thinking of your friends or those people around you, or even your enemies, as we were discussing earlier, who can't really be your enemies if you want to follow Christ. And just let it speak to those pieces. And there's going to be things in this, that you could reach out to me or Steve about if you need some further explanation, or, you're like, what the heck is he talking about here and here and here and here? And you don't want to do the hard work of reading all the source material.
No, and there was
Venmo me a beer or a coffee.
Yeah, there was something about his earlier works. And not maybe, it's where I was at that stage in life that I just could not, it was a difficult read. So I think about generous orthodoxy.
Right.
A new kind of Christian. My brain just could not get it. At the same time, at that stage, Velvet Elvis was very consumable. Like that resonated. This book was a very easy read. It was inviting. It wasn't polarizing, and so many times, regardless of where you fall, and you and I say that we fall on different ends of the spectrum.
We're closer on some of these things.
The things that, I mean, not even political. Like we don't even fall different on political. We don't fall different on social justice. I think at times I tend to fall a little more woo-woo, if you will, a little more, and not the strength.
You're both a little more woo-woo and a little more conservative.
Yeah. But even the conservative, I'm finding myself, like even on this abortion thing,
right?
Like I want to say, don't tell me you're pro-life until you're willing to talk about death row, right? Until you're willing to talk about
war
or
poverty.
You don't get to say that you're pro-life, but it only comes to an unborn fetus. What about the 13-year-old girl? What about her life?
Yeah,
the 13-year-old mom that's pregnant. Like, so we pick and choose
who the laws in the state of Alabama protect the incestuous father more than they do her.
Right. And so all of those are things where I'm probably, like when we talk about me being more conservative, and this is just me unpacking this, is even I'm probably conservative on a few of the things,
fiscally and otherwise.
Yeah, fiscally and one or two other things.
Role
but the
of
rest
big
of
government.
Yeah, like I'm not a big government person, and so I say all of that to say, while I'm all over the place in my spirituality and beliefs, like I feel like it's becoming a goulash for me. I say all of that to say that this book was not off-putting. This book was not labeling. It was not about othering. And that was one of the things I really, and then especially to get to the end, and he says, "Hey, if you choose not to stay with it, that's okay." And I was like, "Gosh, who has the balls to put that out there?"
So a couple of things this is, I don't know, his 18th, 20th book. It's somewhere in there. Second of all, is culture's changed. I mean, think about where we were 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And where we are now. And I mean, I'm going to say it. You've had a huge shift. Not in any kind of bad way or anything, but because you've always been there, but you working at the School of the Arts.
Yes. That was the game changer.
That has been massive for you. And now that you're not attending a church, there's a lot less worry about saying it or listening to it or letting it in. I'm the same way, because after I left Southeastern, call me what you want to call me. I'm not worried if you think I'm a Christian or not anymore.
Right.
I mean, there are times my wife doesn't know if I'm a Christian or not anymore.
What was the chapter where he talks about a reason to stay with it is because of Christ, like the life of Jesus,
because of our legendary founder.
Yes.
And he does good work. I actually found that to be as much about how we read the Bible, literarily, as it was about Jesus, because the Bible is our record of Jesus and those our understanding of that. But I don't know, man. It has been something special. I have gone back with some people, and I've gone back to their. I found them through a current book, and then I go back to their beginning and I try to read chronologically all their work. But there's just been something about me walking with him in real time. Starting with his second book.
Okay.
I quickly went back and read Church on the Other Side.
Okay.
Which was his very first. But to see the progression of a theologian, and he's what I would consider a public theologian, because his work is accessible and it's consumed by the masses or rejected by the masses. But it's just been something special. I don't think of him ever as a dad, but more like a uncle, or someone who just somehow puts the words to what I'm feeling in the time. And that's
how I felt about this book. This was just the whole premise of the book. Do I stay or do I go?
Yeah, faith after doubt was important. I think more so probably for those involved in full-time pastoral ministry than this particular book. As I said it, he's more explicit in this book. You could tell early on, it's like, say what you want to say sometimes, but at the same time, he was truthful answer. It was a both end. It was partially him progressing, but it was partially knowing what Christianity could handle in that time and moment. So anyway, it was a good day. Last night I was at Perry, which is the Pisgah Astronomical Institute of Research and the Pisgah National Forest. That was a great time. And then
did you get to did you look through telescopes and all that fun stuff?
Oh yeah, that's what it is.
Not to oversimplify it, but
no, we were looking, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. How can we take a Bible that was written when there was still a geocentric of the universe? How can people take that serious to literalists when you look through a telescope and you can see galaxies, other galaxies, hundreds of thousands or millions of light years away. So the fact is, you're actually looking back in time.
Yeah. When you're looking at something, how many light years away?
That far away, it's taken that much time for. It's not that God has changed, but it's like he says in this, we have to have new vocabulary. We have to have a new understanding. And that's not unique. This is how Christianity has worked. Don't just read scripture and verse, read the fullness of the story, get the largeness of the arc, check Acts 10 and Acts 15 out, see that there has been this big, long progression, and that Christianity in and of itself is a history of faith progressing and moving forward. That's what he does really, really well. So,
Yeah, I think for me, when I started down, now somewhere along the way in this new path, or the different place on it, or whatever, it was
your path,
my path. How we, over the years as Christians, when looking at Scripture, became so selective on what applied and what didn't apply. Like, oh, we can choose that one, we can choose this one. And so all of a sudden, regardless of whether you look at it as literal, the fact that you can become so selective with it, and even thinking about 30 years ago or 40,
without admitting that you're selective about
right. And 40 years ago, what the church considered being unequally yoked was a biracial marriage. Mixed bathing was a sin.
Okay, you've got to explain that, because that does sound like it might be a sin, Steve Gallagher.
It's not.
But explain to our audience what you mean by mixed bathing.
So growing up, you would hear family members talk about a biracial couple in the community, and you would say as a kid, "Well, what's wrong with that?" Because
no, I think everybody gets that. Mixed bathing, that term.
Oh, mixed bathing. Mixed bathing is when you have a large tub, something that Matt Hewitt would be comfortable in.
I love this.
And then I jump in the other end, and we're able to share.
That is not it. That's
mixed bathing.
All.
Yeah.
No.
Mixed bathing was going to a swimming pool or a swimming hole
with someone of the opposite
sex. And so, we're not talking about skinny dipping.
So I kid you not, the first 10 years of my summer camp experience.
Yes, that's where I was going, was summer church camp.
For Alabama District Assemblies of God church camp, there was a sign that said no mixed bathing. And that meant boys were scheduled at a time other than girls. Not only that, but we had kids swimming in jeans.
Yes.
In jeans.
And the thing was you could not see them in their bathing suit. So, like, when they leave the pool, they have to get fully clothed
or whatever,
right, to leave. And so, like, your schedule, you couldn't even have an overlap. Like, the girls are leaving and you're arriving. It was distanced, and that was considered a sin.
Yeah. I mean, that whole cult of innocence you want to talk about, this cult, this purity cult, or purity, what do we call that we grew up with? I think that's it.
I got a lot of names for it. Yeah.
Purity cult, which was basically.
And Brian even talks about the girl who gets married, that she doesn't even know how to, like, she feels guilty for consummating her marriage. How many times has someone reached out to you within a few months of getting married,
saying it's not working?
Yeah. And all of a sudden you see this heaviness on them. And once you've had the conversation 2 or 3 times, you go, oh, you guys weren't prepared for the sex. You guys weren't prepared for the consummate. And it was like, how did you know? And it was like, well, if you only knew how many people have,
if you've been conditioned that long,
if
you've been conditioned that long to have your foot on the brake, it's hard to move it off that brake and put it on the gas
After
pedal.
20 years of your foot being on the brake, there's this switch that's supposed to flip because you said I do, where now it's okay. And there's no guilt or shame.
Right. It just doesn't work that way for most people. So
how in the heck I got off on that? I don't know, but
Mixed bathing. You said
mixed
something
bathing,
about
yeah, and that
mixed bathing. Gosh, it was. Listen, I'm with Brian in that I don't think there's ill intent in most of these instances,
no,
but there is such a thing as post-traumatic stress disorder from our toxic upbringings and faith, and it's still going on in a lot of places.
and
But
there's conversations around intent versus impact.
yes, and those are important conversations. But the truth of the matter is, if you walk away with a limp or with
Yes,
a
you were
broken neck,
impacted.
you were impacted. And I don't care if you intended
Yeah.
at that point, but I'm bearing the
Hey,
brunt or
you
the
were
hurt.
getting corporal punishment. Your dad's whipping you with a paddle or a belt, and now you have a limp from it. You may not have intended for me to get injured on this, but regardless, yeah, you took my hip out of socket.
Yeah, let me take it serious for one more minute before I
Okay.
move forward and we kind of get into some levity and close this out because this is long. This idea of announcing and renouncing.
Okay.
He actually puts paragraphs in there for people
Mm-hmm.
to look at to say, this is how you could tell your family.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm hanging on as a Christian, but my understanding of it looks different than yours, mom and dad. And I know that might break your heart, but if you're going to love me, then you need to accept me for who I am. You can disagree with what I do, but this is it. Or talking about the person who's leaving the faith and explaining what that would look like to say that. Today's my sister's birthday.
Hey.
Yeah, Jennifer was born on May 11th, and I love her. Announcing, I've announced to her, and I have renounced this. But my greatest regret in ministry was denying my sister communion when I was probably 18 years old.
Like the actual.
She was living with her boyfriend who would become her husband.
Randy?
No, it was one of the Scotts. She's in the past had a propensity for marrying people with the same name anyway, or dating them. Scott was raised an atheist. He didn't know anything about anything as far as it came to church. I'm 18 or so. Why I should have been allowed to hand out communion and how I got it in my head that I had the right to refuse anyone communion is just preposterous to me now. But I can remember praying because they were there at church that day. Please don't get up. Please don't get up. Because I had this horrible understanding of scripture that people were eating death unto themselves by taking communion when they weren't right with God. It's far from the truth as it could possibly be misread.
Your brain.
And so they got up, they walked up the aisle of that church. And I looked my sister in the eye and I said, please don't. I can't allow you to have it. And then we closed the service and had to go to Nana's for family dinner.
Oh.
I had all it was out of love. It truly was out of love, not just for God, but it
you
was
really
love
thought
for
she was
her.
eating death.
I thought she would have damned her soul to hell if she had taken that communion, and damned her boyfriend's soul to hell.
Unknowingly.
I mean, I got to Nana's house and I'm like, I'm so sorry, but again, things were fractured. We have a great relationship now. Happy birthday, sis. We've already texted and anyway, I'm saying, guys, like, there's a part of me that wants to feel so much shame from that moment. There's another part of me that wants to just be so pissed and angry at the church and the people in that particular church who even gave me that right.
Put you in that place.
Put me in that place. There's the bad toxic theology that Brian talks about that would lead me to that place and that decision. It's possible to grow, guys. It's possible to change. There are good people in your lives with great hearts who have been conditioned by the system. They haven't had their aha moment yet.
Yeah.
They haven't had that person yet. Look at them and say, whether you stay in this or not, that's not going to affect our friendship. And I hope those of you who are listening to this, and we know you and you consider Steve and I your friend, know that we're in that same place.
Yes.
You're
and remember you were in that place once too.
Of
Highly
course.
likely. Yeah.
Of course. So let's have grace and love for one another. Again, what if the Christian church just started to concern itself with deeply loving everyone around us?
There's a concept.
Right? Be kind, do justice, and do mercy.
Yep.
Walk humbly. He talks about it.
He references that in here. Yeah.
He does. All right. Well,
so again, the name of the book is Do I Stay Christian? A Guide for the Doubters, the Disappointed, and the Disillusioned.
Out May the 24th.
Out May the 24th. We can't say enough good stuff about it, obviously. And I love the logo for St. Martin's Publishing.
It's pretty awesome. Do you know how many times I've actually considered getting a tattoo of Brian on my body?
I thought you were going to say the spiral. The logo I was talking about was spiral. Then all of a sudden, hey, and in closing, I'll say this. I didn't ask him if he's ever been told he looks like Dave Ramsey.
Thank you.
I did that for you.
I mean, I could say that same thing about you, Steve.
What?
You kind of resemble Dave.
Dave Ramsey?
Yeah.
No. Different frames. We're both bald. That's like saying you look
You're white and bald. You're white and bald.
Wow. That's like saying you look like John Goodman. Wait a minute. Bad example.
Kind of do.
You do.
I love you, man. Thanks for doing this.
I love you. Thank you.
Hey, who do we need to have next? Can we get Belle?
I can reach out and
want to wait a little while?
Yeah, we'll space it out.
Ooh, you know what we need? Do we want to look at the list and interview someone during Goose for our podcast, or do we want it just be me and you? Or an audience question?
Yeah, we can look and see who's there. We got to figure out what the what they've got us lined up for is. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm glad this worked out.
Yeah, me too.
So we'll talk again soon. Love you. Hope you have a good rest of your day.
I think I'm gonna go watch Batman. The Batman.
Go up to Deep Creek.
I've already been there once today. I might go again with Nicole this afternoon.
Yeah.
Anyway.
All right.
Feel better. I know you haven't been feeling well. Yep. Pedialyte.
Lots of Pedialyte. All right. Love you. Bye.